honored we are to come and sit as the disciples once did around the feet of Jesus, to hear him speak once again, to bring truth, light, power, and hope in a place of darkness. Lord God, we invite you this morning to just carve away into our hard hearts, that we would experience you, hear your voice, and be transformed. Use me, Lord. I'm not worthy, but I'm here. And you've poured so many things into me, Lord. Help me to stay out of the way and just pour directly out the things that you want known this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. You may be seated. Well, we are concluding our series called For the Joy, Christ's Journey to the Cross. We are examining why Jesus went to the cross. Not just the reason for it, but the motivation behind it. And what we have seen is in Hebrews 12:2. It basically tells us. It says, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus went to the cross to save us. And the motivation behind it was joy. Not joy in what was involved in going to the cross, because crucifixion was a brutal form of death even back then. Even the Romans understood the horror of it. They wouldn't even permit one of their own citizens to be executed that way. Even a criminal, they wouldn't. Jesus took no joy in the mode of his death, but he certainly took joy in what it would accomplish. But we saw that it wasn't easy. There were three things that were standing in his way. And we've also seen that as we seek to make application in these circumstances, that when we seek to be faithful to him, to respond to him for what he did on our behalf, we're going to face three obstacles. The first is depletion. Fatigue took a toll on Jesus, and he had to turn to God and receive power from him in order to carry out what he sought to do. Last week we saw that defection will stand in the way. Not everybody who begins by trying to be faithful to God will end up that way. That along the path many will fall away, and we don't want to be numbered among them. And today we're going to take a look at the greatest struggle that any of us has if we seek to be faithful to God, and that is doubt. And Jesus had to deal with that among those who were the closest to him, who had seen the most miracles that were beyond description. They had heard teaching that nobody else had ever heard before. They had an audience with the divine. And yet they still struggled to wrap their minds and, more importantly, their hearts around that which they were being exposed to. So today we're going to take a look at that. John chapter 20, I invite you to turn there. And as you do, I'm going to bring you up to speed with what's going on in our story. The events today are going to take place in the aftermath of Jesus' resurrection. After Jesus rose from death, he appeared to several people. First of all, to Mary Magdalene in Mark 16 and John 20. And I've taught you through what happened in that encounter. Then the other women who went to the tomb with her that morning to prepare Jesus' body for what they thought would be a long rest there, and got quite a surprise in Matthew 28. Then later to a pair of disciples who were on their way to a little village near Jerusalem called Emmaus in Luke 24. Then to Peter all by himself in Luke 24:34. And then to a gathering of his remaining disciples, or 10 of them, I should say, who had gotten together because of all of the reports that were going on that Sunday. And some of the people who were saying that they had seen him alive, they met to discuss that. And Jesus appeared to them while they were there. Luke 24, Matthew 16, John 20. And with each subsequent manifestation of the risen Christ, the disciples who had previously been stunned with sorrow and disbelief and confusion were suddenly changed. They were filled with joy, wonder, and marvelous faith, except for one. There was still one of the remaining 11 whose last mental image of his beloved rabbi was of a blood-soaked, lifeless body. He had not seen the resurrected Christ. We'll talk about why in a few minutes here. It's likely that Thomas was his name, had been so broken by the trauma of Jesus' death that he didn't want to believe in anything or anyone ever again. Ever had something like that happen to you? Something that just so rocks you that you just want to close your mind off and lock your heart up and not believe in anything or anyone ever again so that you can't be hurt? Thomas understands that. So it's probably not a big surprise that when the other disciples were excited and when they had gotten together and were trying to figure out all these stories, the women were telling them one thing and Peter was telling them something else, and these two that had been in Emmaus and met the risen Christ were talking about, and everybody's probably talking at the same time, and they're gathered together and trying to make sense of it. And in the midst of all the confusion, Jesus appears. But I suppose it's not a big surprise that Thomas wasn't with them at the time. But they eventually found him. And when they did, they all tried to convince him that they had seen Jesus, that he was no longer dead. They tried to explain to him some of the things that Jesus had taught before. They were excited and exhilarated. And despite their insistence, there was something in Thomas's heart, something in his mind that just would not believe. It had just been shut down. Couldn't hear what they were saying. He refused to listen to it. He didn't know what had happened. People do strange things sometimes. Maybe the whole group was suffering from some sort of grief-triggered mass delusion. Or maybe it was just a tragic case of mistaken identity. Whatever the explanation, there was one cold, hard reality that was inescapable. The Master had died gruesomely on a Roman cross, and no amount of wishful thinking or fanciful storytelling was going to bring him back. No matter what they said, the only way that he could or would ever believe that Jesus had returned from the grave would be if he could see him. But not just see him. Examine him from head to toe. He'd have to verify where the nails had been driven through his wrist. He'd have to see where the sword had pierced his side. He would have to have it in his hands before he could even begin to accept that the incredible things they were saying were true. Which brings us to our passage, John chapter 20, starting at verse 26. Hopefully you're there. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." It says it was a week later. That means basically a week after that first Sunday when Jesus had risen and people had begun to see him and interact with him. And then the disciples had gotten together probably later in the day in order to meet and discuss it all. They're all there, except for Judas, who is either dead already or soon to be, and Thomas. So this is a week after that Easter Sunday. And it says this time Thomas was with them. Now, we're not told exactly why he hadn't been with them before. We do know that when Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, just outside of Jerusalem, that all of the disciples had fled. They had scattered into the wind, and they went into hiding. Matthew 26, verse 56 tells us that. And so when they went to find Thomas later on, to bring him in for this meeting, maybe he was too afraid. Because these were hunted men. We'll see that in a minute. Or maybe he was just in too much despair. Or maybe he had gone so much into hiding that they simply couldn't find him. But whatever the case was, he hadn't been at that first meeting, but they had since located him and brought him to this one, and now they're trying to sway him. They're trying to help him understand and to help him see what the truth is. Ever tried to convince somebody of something that was so important, but you just can't seem to get through? That's how the other disciples felt. And it says the doors were locked. That's because these guys were still living like fugitives. They knew that the Jewish religious leaders who had been responsible for arresting and putting on a mock trial, because they already knew what the outcome was going to be, and then using the Romans to put Jesus to death in horrifying nature. They knew that they weren't satisfied with that. They were still looking for the leaders of what they considered to be this cult, and that meant that the original 12 were prime targets. So they were living in hiding. They had the doors locked. They were afraid that every knock were the Jewish religious leaders, were the temple guard coming to take them away to suffer the same fate as Jesus. And it says that behind these locked doors, as this animated discussion was going on, I'm sure a lot of cross-talking was going on and a lot of head shaking on the part of Thomas. Really kind of business as usual for the disciples. We always think of the disciples as being almost like, the dwarves from Snow White, singing a song, walking in a line, all in perfect harmony. These guys squabbled all the time. They were like brothers, and they fought like brothers. They disagreed. They were trying to one-up one another. They were trying to become the teacher's pet to the rabbi. They were trying to prove who was going to be the greatest. They were all trying to seize power. Jesus must have had his handful with these knuckleheads. And so now they're all back and forth, and they're excited and they're joyous, except for Thomas, who's still despondent. They're behind locked doors because they're still afraid they're going to be arrested. There's a cacophony of noise, and then all of a sudden it says that Jesus came and stood among them. And the inference in the original Greek that this story is written in, it isn't that Jesus came, quietly knocked on the door, was allowed in, walked into the room, and then finally said, ahem. No, the inference from the languages is that he wasn't there, and then he was. He suddenly appeared, which is miraculous. And I think this miracle was designed, one, to sort of calm them down a little bit, because Jesus always had a calming effect on the disciples. He was the one figure for all of the differences that they had with each other, because these were guys that were from different walks of life. Even though they were all Jewish, they were so different from one another. Really a picture of the way the church is supposed to work, and often does work. Squabbling, disagreeing, one-upping, trying to prove who's the real leader. And Jesus would show up and everybody would suddenly come into line. So he shows up and it has a calming effect. And it's It's identification. Who but Jesus could do something like this? And he speaks and he says to them what must have been so familiar. You must never forget that the disciples and Christ himself, these were Jewish men, which meant they were Jewish to the bone. And the most common Jewish greeting back then, today in Israel, is Shalom. Peace be with you. And so Jesus showed up, and in the way that only he could say it, with the intonation that only he had, in a recognizable voice, he said, Shalom. Now, in Greek it says, Irene. That's the word that's used here. Irene is actually the root of our proper name, Irene, today. And it means the same thing. It's the Greek equivalent of shalom. But I have no doubt that what Jesus said to them was shalom. Verse 27. Then Jesus said to Thomas, put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. Now, first of all, isn't it interesting that Jesus walks into a room crowded with men who are, like I said before, were no doubt involved in animated conversation with one another. And he comes in, and I'm sure that it quieted the room when he got there. If for nothing else, it's like, what? Where did you come from? The first time he showed up and did that to these guys at that first meeting, they thought it was a ghost. That's how much he scared them. And so here he shows up immediately, and then they calm right down. But notice that he doesn't address the crowd, which he most often does. He doesn't say, men, listen to me. Isn't it interesting that he comes into the room and he goes immediately to the one person who was still struggling the most? He goes right to Thomas. And he speaks to him and he says, Thomas, here I am. Put your finger here. Reach out your hand. Put it to my side. What Jesus is doing here is actually saying back to Thomas the very words that Thomas himself had spoken in response to all of the disciples telling him, we've seen Jesus, and Thomas saying, no, you didn't. And the only way I'm going to believe any of this nonsense is if I can touch him myself. And so Jesus actually requotes back to Thomas his own words, which is a demonstration, again, of his miraculous power. It's interesting that Jesus demonstrates the same miraculous power early on in this same gospel. In John 1:48, Jesus encounters a man named Nathanael, who one of his disciples, Philip, had gone to bring. And then he reveals to Nathanael, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. And he reveals to him so much, I've already taught you this story, so much of what was going on, that Nathanael immediately, right there at the very beginning, before he's even seen any of the miracles that the other disciples had seen, he says, you're the Christ, you're the Son of God. Which demonstrates that faith sometimes comes easier for some than it does for others. But there was enough here, even with Jesus telling Thomas what Thomas had said earlier when Jesus wasn't there physically to hear it. Something only God can do, when he can either read your mind and tell you what you're thinking or tell you what you said when he wasn't around. This is the kind of stuff that only God can do. But Jesus goes even further. Even though he's affirming Thomas's faith by just telling him what he said earlier, he goes beyond that and he says, Thomas, the very things that you said you needed to believe, well, here I am. Have at it. You want to see my wrists where the nail went in? Bring your hand over here. Touch it. You want to see where the Roman guard ran his spear through me after I was dead to make sure I was dead? Here, let me pull up my tunic. Here it is. You want to see it? Put your hand inside of it, which tells you that Jesus did still bear the scars of his own crucifixion. He's removing any lingering doubt about the physical nature of his resurrection. He didn't want them to think he was a ghost. He wasn't a ghost. He had risen with a body, a physical body. At that first meeting with the disciples, he actually ate something to prove that he was a real person. Here he's saying to Thomas, put your hand on the scars. I want you to know I'm physically here. This would be very important because later on, there would be a heresy that would start sweeping through the church that taught that Jesus didn't physically resurrect. He just kind of came back as a ghost. And now he tells Thomas, stop doubting and believe. Now, when you first read that, it seems a little bit maybe harsh. Like basically, Thomas, quit being so dumb. Okay? Quit being doubting Thomas the way we know him now, right? Quit being such a doubter. And I really don't think that's how Jesus viewed Thomas. Listen, if Jesus felt contempt for Thomas, or if the doubt that Thomas was struggling with here was the same kind of unbelieving doubt that people like the Pharisees had, Jesus wouldn't have done what he was doing here. Listen, Jesus has gone out of his way to come back to another meeting of his disciples just to speak to Thomas, just to address his doubt, his struggle. So Jesus isn't chastising him with the sense of, when are you going to just stop being so ignorant and foolish? I think what he's trying to do is, Thomas, listen, come on, you can do it. You can make the gap here between where you've been and where you need to be. Now, the reason why Thomas's unbelief was a little bit different than the others was because of the fact that what Thomas had been told was that Jesus had raised. And what was important was who had told him. Who were the ones that had told Thomas they had seen Jesus raised? The other disciples, right? They were the ones who had brought him the quote-unquote good news, which is the root of the word gospel. They had brought it to Thomas and had told him, we've seen him resurrected. And what had Thomas, how he responded? I'm sorry, I can't believe it. Why was that problematic? Because Thomas was refusing to believe the testimony of the very men who were going to be charged to take this message into the world later on. What would have happened if the rest of the world had responded to these men the way Thomas did? Okay? The disciples go out into the world in the first century and they start proclaiming the good news, which history teaches us is exactly what happened. What happens if they get to everybody out there and all those people respond the way he had? What if Thomas gets out there and starts talking about, no, I really saw him, the scars, everything, he was alive, I saw him. And they say, no, I'm sorry, Thomas. You sound like you're well-intentioned, but I can't believe it. The faith would have died out in the first century. That's why Thomas's doubt is particularly bothersome here, because he's refusing to believe the people who were charged by Jesus to take this story out. So that's an issue. But at the same time, like I said, there's a difference between someone's doubt and someone's temporal misgivings. And Jesus wanted no doubt in these guys' minds that he is resurrected, because they were the ones who were going to have to go out and tell the story. And just about every single one of them went to their death making the same proclamation. In other words, they died for what they were saying was true. Verse 28, Thomas said to him, my Lord and my God. Now here's where I think there's a little bit of injustice. Again, even a person that has never been to church or has only been a few times, everybody's heard of doubting Thomas, right? We still use that colloquialism today. Whenever somebody is skeptical, oh, you're a doubting Thomas. Imagine being immortalized. You're one of the disciples, and what are you remembered for? Oh, you're the doubter. And yet, you know what's fascinating? Is that Thomas here based simply on seeing Jesus resurrected, makes one of the most amazing, one of the greatest acknowledgments of who Jesus really was in the entire New Testament. My Lord and my God. He's essentially saying, Jesus, you are the Jehovah of Israel. Now, for any Israeli to say that would be considered blasphemy. Those who even intimated that. When Jesus intimated that during his public ministry, it says that the Pharisees and even some in the crowd would pick up stones to stone him because they thought he was blaspheming. You, being a man, make yourself equal with God. Isn't it interesting that Jesus never corrects Thomas for what he says? He allows him to worship him as God. Angels never did that. In Revelation 19 and in Revelation 22, when John tries to worship angels because they're these powerful beings proclaiming this message of what's going to happen in the days ahead, the angels immediately shut it down and said, no, don't you do that. Worship God only. Jesus allows Thomas to do that. I just think it's a little bit unfair that the only way we think of Thomas is just, you're the doubter, when in fact he actually makes a pretty staggering proclamation of faith here. Verse 29. Then Jesus told him, because you have seen me, you have believed? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Now here's something interesting. Just like the other disciples, who, by the way, had their moment where they didn't believe either. The Bible says that when the women came back from the tomb and told the disciples that they had seen the risen Christ, you know what they said to the women? Nonsense. Nonsense. We tend to think, again, the disciples were these faith-filled religious icons who, as soon as they got word that Jesus had risen, were just, oh, praise the Lord. I love that little video before, but let me tell you something. Peter didn't raise his hands in prayer and praise in the tomb. The Bible says that when Peter and John left the tomb, John believed, Peter didn't know what to think. I think that's why Jesus had to appear to Peter by himself. Now Jesus says, you've seen me, and so you've believed. And it's more a statement of fact than anything else. And it was important that they had. I'm not saying that it's wrong that they had to have the evidence that they had to have in order to be swayed. It was important that these guys believed beyond the shadow of a doubt that Jesus had risen, because they were going to have to deal with all of the people out in the world who were going to be skeptical, who were going to attack them, who were going to say to them what they had said to the women. Nonsense. They had to be absolutely sure, and God had no problem with that, and that's why Jesus goes to all the trouble that he goes to for them to see enough proof to be swayed. And by the way, the fact that it took them so long, the fact that they were so skeptical, is an indication that these weren't gullible men. These weren't easily swayed men. These weren't little quislings that just believed whatever they were told. These were hard-headed men who had lived in a real blue-collar world their whole life. They were hard to convince. It took a miracle for them to be swayed. But once they were, that same obstinance, that same sense of, they don't want to be duped, convinced them and changed them forever. They go from being the way they were, huddled, afraid, with the door locked, and not wanting to show their face in public. They go from that to preaching in the streets, to being willing to be arrested. They become bold, articulate, powerful men under the influence of the Holy Spirit, and because they were swayed by what they saw. And as I said before, most went to their death to make this proclamation. But here is maybe the most interesting statement of everything Jesus said. He said, You're blessed because you've seen me. You've seen all the evidence. You know now that I have physically resurrected. But let me tell you something. Blessed are the people who are going to believe, and they're never going to see me. Now, who's he talking about? Okay, you need to understand the Bible says that after Jesus resurrected, he appeared to over 500 people. Not just a small handful of his closest followers. 500. Now, that had to have pretty much included everybody that was following him at that time. Everybody got to see him resurrected. So he isn't talking about the immediate group of his closest followers during his public ministry. Do you know who he's talking about? He's talking about those of you who've come to saving faith. He's saying that you receive a special blessing because you came to faith without ever seeing the scars or the resurrected Christ. I find that fascinating. What Jesus is saying here is that the future vehicle through which people were going to come to faith was not going to be personal experience. Jesus isn't going to personally appear to every single person who's out there with doubt, saying, well, I'd like to believe, and maybe if I could see Jesus and look at the scars and maybe touch him, maybe I could believe. And Jesus said, no, I'm not going to do that. If you're going to come to faith, it's going to require something different than seeing with your eyes and touching with your hands. You're going to have to come to me in a different way. But here's the thing. It's not going to be unreasonable. It's not going to be impossible. And here we're getting to the crux of how we deal with doubt, because everybody struggles with doubt at some point. We doubt so many things. We doubt our life and the direction that it's taking. We doubt each other, including people that we love. We doubt God. We doubt the world around us. We're by nature skeptical. It's how we keep ourselves safe. It's how we keep ourselves from being hurt. We're given to doubt constantly. How do we get past our doubt to come to a place where we can feel assured about something? Jesus said it's not only possible, but you can be blessed in doing so. Now, in saying that, you need to know that he isn't denigrating the disciples / the apostles for having seen with their own eyes and then believing. You know, seeing is believing. You ever heard that? That's what the apostles did. They saw and they believed. He's not saying, well, you don't really have any faith compared to the people that are going to come later on. He's just saying that it's a different kind of blessing. But what he's saying is, whereas with you, the way you came to believe was that you actually did see, you had tangible physical evidence in front of you, those who come later on are going to come to the same confident assurance, but in a different way, through the vehicle of faith. But it's not blind faith. It's not unreasonable faith. It's actually faith in what you apostles are going to tell them and attest to later on. It's what you're going to record when you tell your gospel stories. It's what you're going to go to your deaths being unwilling to turn from as a demonstration of the fact that it really is true. God is going to use you and what you're seeing right now to communicate that to other people. And then those people are going to receive a special blessing. Whereas for you, seeing is believing. For them, believing will be seeing. When they come to faith, they're going to have every same experience of my presence with them as you have now, which I think is fascinating. Jesus is saying that the people who don't get to see me physically resurrected are still going to be very able to come to faith. And when they do, they're going to receive a blessing that's equal to, if not greater than the one you're receiving. All right, let's talk about doubt. How do we deal with doubt when we struggle with it? In the passage here, we're going to see there are three things that Thomas does to help resolve his doubt, and that if you do these things, they'll help resolve yours too. The first is investigation. In verse 27, Jesus invites Thomas to investigate the things that he's struggling with, the things that he has doubts with. He says, put your fingers here, see my hands, reach out your hand and put it to my side. You know, God isn't afraid of our doubt. Matter of fact, you never need to have doubt when you really have the truth. The truth can always bear up under investigation. God tells us often, He's, come, let's reason together. He promises that if we seek truth, we will be affirmed in finding it. John the Apostle was probably the closest to Jesus of all the original disciples. And I find fascinating the things that he wrote, because I think John anticipates the very things that you and I struggle with today. One of the things we struggle with is this stuff really real? You know, especially those of you who maybe have been brought up by parents who went to church. You know, your parents took you to church and you heard all those stories at bedtime. Tonight, I'm going to tell you the story of David and Goliath. And you heard all that stuff, and you were around it, then you went to school. You began to learn that not everybody believes all that stuff. Matter of fact, maybe none of your friends did. And your teachers didn't. Those of you who are young enough to be around with the technological revolution of the internet began to realize that most of the world doesn't believe any of this. And then you're left with a quandary. Did my parents lie to me? Is this just a charade? Is any of this stuff true? Maybe that's where you're at right now. You know? I think John understood that. So what did he say about it? In 1 John chapter 1, verse 1, listen to what he says. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. In John's parlance, the word of life is just a metaphor for the person of Jesus. And what John is saying is, I want to tell you a story. But this isn't a once upon a time story. This is a story about something that I saw with my own eyes. I touched with my own hands. This is not a fairy tale that was passed on to me from my father and grandfather. This is something that I encountered. And I am telling you with all of my soul, it's true. And I'm willing to put my life on the line to prove it. I believe this with all of my heart. You know, my kids, one of the things they're stuck with because I'm a pastor is the fact that I'm a storyteller. And I've told them countless stories. Countless. I can always tell when I'm repeating because the eyes immediately start to roll back. Oh, no, not this one again. Right? I tell a lot of stories from a lot of different places. I think the ones, though, that maybe have the most impact with them are the ones that are about things that happened to me. Things that I actually did. And I know there's times when they hear me talk about some of the insane things that I did, that they think, did you really do that? Yeah. And there have been times when the stories that I've told them that maybe they had a little incredulity about, they get verified from an outside source, and all of a sudden they come back to me, and I can always tell they were doubting. You know why? They're like, you really did do that. You really did. Wow. Right? That's what John's doing. We did this. We saw him. We knew him. The Lord is not afraid of our investigation. He invites us, and we have plenty of testimony to prove that these things were true. I mean, John said, basically in his gospel account, he says, I could tell you a lot more stories. I could tell you an endless book of stories and of sayings, things that Jesus said, things that Jesus did. But I think this is sufficient for you to believe and to have life. Isn't that fascinating? The first time I read that, I thought to myself, you mean this isn't everything? There's more? Oh yeah, there's a whole lot more that Jesus said and did. Gosh, I wish I knew what it was. But he says, listen, what I've given you is enough. If you don't believe what I've given you, then nothing's going to change your mind. God is not afraid of our investigation, but investigation is not enough. We also have to identify who Jesus is. Identification. There are two important questions when it comes to this story or any story about Jesus, but this is the most important. Number one, did Jesus really do what people said? Did he really do it? Did he really come back from death? Is it true? And maybe the second question, an equally important one, is, so what? What does that mean to me? You know, it's interesting. There's a story in Matthew 16. Jesus was walking with his disciples. I'm sure they were having their usual spirited discussions. And all of a sudden he turns to them and he says, who do people say I am? Now maybe they had been whispering to one another. Did you hear what so-and-so said? You know who they think he is? And he turns around and, reading their minds, says, well, who do people say I am? Which I'm sure the disciples were like, he's doing it again. We've got to stop thinking things because the man can read our mind. Who do people say that I am? And so then all of a sudden the disciples, they jump right in and they start putting out all the speculation. Well, some people think you're Elijah. Some people think you're this. Some people think you're one of the prophets. And notice Jesus doesn't leave it there or even answer the speculation. He turns it right to them and he says, well, who do you say I am? Which was the far more important question. And it's the same question that you and I are going to have to answer when we're struggling with doubt. Did Jesus really do what he did? Do I really believe it? And if so, what does that mean to me? Okay, so when we're struggling with doubt, we need to do investigation, we need to do identification, and then lastly, we need insight. How do you figure out whether or not Jesus did what he did? And therefore figure out what it means to you. You can't go back and see it. You weren't born at the time that it happened. You're not one of the original disciples. But you want to know something? They were there, and they still struggled to believe that it was real. And one of them, actually, we talked about this last week, even after everything he saw, refused to believe, betrayed him, and wound up destroying himself. You don't have to have been there to come to an assurance of what's true. What you need is something very important, though, and that is faith. The Bible says without it, it's impossible to please God, and more importantly, it's impossible to know him. But is faith such a foreign thing? You know, we all have faith. Even the people who say they don't have faith, they have faith. The people who say they don't believe in God, they all believe in something. Everybody believes in something. It's not that the concept of faith is so foreign. The only issue is, what is your faith in? We can have faith even though we weren't there to see it. What is our faith in? Our faith is in the account of those who were and went to their deaths, unwilling to turn away from the fact that what they saw was what they saw. And not only that, but when you can bridge that gap by faith, you know what else? God floods into your heart all of the blessing of reassurance that these men had. Did you know that you can have the same confidence that Jesus has raised from the dead that the apostles had? It just comes in a different way. For them, seeing was believing. For you, believing will be seeing. And that is so hard to explain to people because most people today want to go the route of seeing is believing. Prove it's true and I'll believe it. Really? What would it take for me to prove it to you? What if I did a miracle? If I did a miracle, would that assure that everybody would believe? What if I raised somebody from the dead? What if I got rid of leprosy? What if I cast out a demon? What if I gave somebody sight who was blind? Would that do it? Because they got to tell you, Jesus did all that stuff and it didn't do it for most. You see, unbelief is a decision of morality, not of theology. We don't believe because we don't want to believe. But if you're really seeking, if you're really sincerely trying to find the truth, it isn't such a great leap of faith. And there's plenty of information and evidence in which to place your faith. And Peter wrote about that, another guy who was there. Listen to him talk to the first century church, filled with people who hadn't seen Jesus resurrected. And listen to what Peter says. 1 Peter 1, starting at verse 8. Though you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and are filled with an inexpressible and glorious joy, for you are receiving the end result of your faith, the salvation of your souls. What an amazing thing. Peter says, you haven't seen him, and yet you've been saved, and you have an inexpressible and glorious joy, just like I have, just like John has, just like Paul has. All the apostles who got to see him resurrected, you have that same joy because of your faith. What an amazing blessing. You know, doubt can be counterproductive, and it can be embarrassing. You know, not long ago, there was a woman, her name is Amanda, and she had her ID stolen, her physical ID, like her purse and all of her stuff in it. Imagine how disconcerting that would be today's era. And so the police were called, and they started doing an investigation. And believe it or not, they actually found her stolen ID. And so the police tried to contact her to let her know. One of the officers, a guy by the name of Chase Fullington, he's with the Portland Police Bureau, East Precinct, who had been assigned to the case. He tried to call this Amanda gal, and she never called back, never responded. So he sent her a text message. And he got a text message back from her. And here's what she said. There is no way a cop has my cell phone number. Nice try, you creep. All right. So now you're this police officer. What do? Well, he got an idea, and so he sent her this. A selfie of himself in front of his proud car, in his uniform, with her ID in his hand. She sheepishly replied to him with a laughing/crying emoji and essentially apologizing and then promising that she would give him a call when she got off work. You know, it's okay to be careful, but sometimes we have to be able to move past that natural cynicism that we have, our crass nature, and begin to believe in that which is worthy of believing. This is worthy, and this will change your life. And when you do, that becomes the portal of experiencing all of the joy and delight that the original disciples felt when they saw the risen Jesus. You can see him too. in your heart and receive an amazing blessing. My prayer is that you will in fact do that. Father, I pray for those who've raised their hand. I pray that their faith would come to life. I pray that their doubt would melt. I pray you would bring assurance into their heart and transformation by the flood of the Holy Spirit coming into them, that their lives would begin to change, that their passions would begin to turn toward you, that they would find a copy of your word and begin to read it, that they would begin to talk to you in prayer, that they would commit to either this church or another Bible-teaching church where they could begin to grow in their faith, and that, Lord, you would just change everything for them, just like you did the disciples, that they would leave here full of joy that's almost inexpressible because of their faith. Lord God, I thank you for changing me. I thank you for all the others that you have changed. And Lord, we now go into search for others who are ready to hear your voice and to join your family. Thank you for these lessons and so many more to come. In Jesus' name.